My name is Brendan O'Reilly. I am the president of the Press Club of Long Island. We are the local chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists. Tonight's event is Fostering Diversity in the Newsroom, and our esteemed moderator is Nakeem Grant. Nakeem is the chair of our Diversity and Inclusion Committee. And Nakeem, please take it away from here.
Sure. Thank you so much, Brendan. And first off, thank you so much to everyone for coming out this evening. I really appreciate it. And yeah, looking forward to a really, thought-provoking discussion this evening. As Brendan mentioned, I'm head of the Diversity Committee here at the PCLI, and I was a former editor at the Long Island Herald for the past 4 years. And with me today on the panel are Amy Rodriguez. She is the managing editor for News 12, the Bronx and Brooklyn, in the Bronx and Brooklyn. And she's worked at News 12 Networks for the past 9 years. And we have, secondly, we have Calvin Lawrence Jr., the Director of Community Affairs and Newsroom Development at Newsday. And he's responsible for the media company's community outreach efforts, and in addition to their recruiting, training, and overall well-being of Newsday's journalists. And then lastly, we have our my former editor, Scott Brinton, a Press Club of Long Island past president and a Long Island Journalism Hall of Fame inductee. And he's the executive editor of the 18th edition Herald Community Newspapers. And he's also an adjunct professor of journalism at Hofstra University. And that's a fun fact. That's where I had met Scott, and that's where I became an intern and got involved in community journalism. And of course, the rest is history as to me becoming an editor at the Herald. So thanks so much again. And I guess just to kick things off, I guess the first question I have this evening is for the panel is, what has your experience been like with regards to diversity in the newsroom? I guess, what are some of the benefits that you've come across with regards to working with diverse colleagues? For this question, I'll start with Amy.
Sure. First, thank you guys for inviting me and allowing me the opportunity to speak on this topic. I will say that I've worked in a variety of newsrooms, one being very diverse and one being not so diverse. And I feel like in both I've had unique experiences. And the one where maybe the newsroom wasn't diverse at the time, I felt like I had a voice and I had a unique perspective to bring. And I was lucky enough that for the most part, I had people that were listening to that perspective. And I found that in that newsroom, it was important for diverse voices to be there. It was important for me to be in that newsroom. In the newsroom where there's more diverse folks, I have found that there's still within diversity, there's still different perspectives, because not every diversity, not every minority person thinks the same way, which is why it's important to just have more than one.
I guess we can jump to Calvin for this question as well.
Yeah, Nakeem, I have also, just like Amy, worked in newsrooms with varying degrees of diversity. And for me, you look around the room, and if you don't see anybody who looks like you, you start questioning whether you belong there or not. You question whether those sorts of diverse community opinions and thoughts and feedback are valued in a place where you're the only one. I know technically it shouldn't matter, but it really does. I think it affects your temperament. I think it affects your commitment to the organization. I think that's one of the reasons there's so much turnover often in newsrooms, is because journalists of color just kind of get so discouraged that they think this is not the place for me, this is not where I belong. So belonging, I think, is key for me.
And Scott, for you, I guess, what's your experience been like with regards to diversity in the newsroom?
Well, I think it's important to recognize, for starters, that Long Island is an incredibly diverse place. And if you don't have diversity within your newsroom, how are you going to properly cover a place as diverse as Long Island is? I mean, it sounds kind of strange because traditionally Long Island's been seen as this lily white community. But if you go across our coverage area, certainly that the Herald covers on the South Shore of Long Island and on the North Shore, but certainly on the South Shore. I mean, town of Hempstead is one of the most diverse places in the world, just looking at all the different cultures and peoples. So I think there's a definite importance there to have different perspectives within your newsroom to be able to properly cover your readers, in our case, readers. So that's first off. But I think about what one journalist, we were recently having a conversation about this in our newsroom, and the friendships that Nakeem developed, he developed friendships throughout our newsroom. And something really just struck me, what Mike Smullins was talking about when he said, I would go to you and talk to you about how to cover diversity. And he was always having questions, and that you were somebody he could turn to for advice, for friendship, but a lot of advice. And I thought that was just really striking, because that's what happens when there's good synergy in a newsroom. But absent that diversity, there isn't that synergy. And then you only have your own perspective. If it's one perspective, that's the only perspective that you're going to be covering. So for me, it's just been great. We can talk a little bit about that more, but it's just great to have a diverse newsroom.
And I would just follow up on one of the points that Scott raised in terms of coverage. It's a good one. I would take it a step further and just kind of view this issue from the perspective of the people we're actually covering. We like to think that these folks don't care what the journalists who are covering them look like, but I think that's so far from the truth. I mean, we hear from folks who say, "Listen, I really appreciated that that reporter speaks Spanish, or that reporter looks like me," and that's kind of how you build trust with your audiences, I think. So that's another reason why it's such a valuable tool.
Absolutely. No, I'm glad you brought that point up. I mean, that's something I was going to touch on as well, was, the fact that at the Herald, we've had, I got to work alongside reporters like you said, who were, people who were from Hispanic communities. And like you said, they were bilingual, and, that was such a invaluable tool that they were able to, like you said, be able to better relate to people in their community and people who spoke their language and things of that sort. And just to piggyback on a point that Scott had mentioned, just the fact that people in the newsroom were able to come to me about, certain topics and subjects. It was kind of a two-way street. I mean, I got to also get their ideas and their perspectives as well with regards to tackling different issues and stuff like that. And so, I mean, just working at the Herald in particular, it was, really remarkable to see, as Scott had mentioned, the different relationships and the different ideas that we were able to bounce off of each other, simply because we were a pretty diverse group. And I would say still to this day, the group there is very diverse. So all very good points.
I just want to add one thing to what Calvin said, because if I can piggyback on what Calvin said here, speaking particularly of Hispanic speaking community, we have at least 3 now of our reporters who are Spanish speakers. We're a relatively small staff of 26, so 3 is a pretty good number considering the size of our staff. And I just think about how many times that they've conducted interviews in Spanish and translated what has been said. And I think about how, if they weren't there, those voices would have never been heard. So it is just so critical that we have diversity within our newsroom.
Absolutely. And just going off that point, going into the next question that I have for the panelists this evening is, I guess, what are the necessary steps that news outlets should take to increase that diversity so that their readership or their viewership feels like they're being well represented? I'll start with Scott for this question.
Well, I think the most important thing is to make a commitment that you're going to have a diverse newsroom. I mean, that's the first step. You have to consciously commit to the idea that we're going to have a diverse newsroom. When I became executive editor 5 years ago, that was my goal, to have a diverse newsroom that reflected our coverage area, our communities, our readers. So that's first. After that, you really have to think differently when you're recruiting, because if you simply put up your ad on ZipRecruiter, almost exclusively you'll have white candidates coming in, and nothing wrong with white candidates, of course, but that's going to be exclusively, almost exclusively, the type of candidate they're coming in through some type of traditional means. So you have to look in alternative ways. And you really have to go to the reporters and the candidates themselves. So that means going to recruitment fairs. So you can meet the reporters, you can meet while they're still students and see them and talk to them and get to know them and gain their trust that you're a newsroom that is committed to the idea of we're a diverse newsroom, we're going to cover diversity issues. And so that's really what I've been focusing on. I go to a lot of recruitment fairs. The other thing is that I'm also pretty fortunate to be an adjunct professor. So I get to meet lots of students. I see lots of different students. And I'm able to recruit as an adjunct professor. So that's very helpful. But I really think you have to go to where those reporters are, because you're not necessarily going to find them through traditional means. And just statistically speaking, you know, most of the candidates who are going to come in through traditional means are going to be white. So you have to go to them.
For Amy,
from my experience, it's twofold, right? So yes, it is important to go to those fairs. And if you're looking for diverse candidates, there are specific fairs like the National Association of Hispanic Journalists, the National Association of Black journalists. So there are Asian Americans also have a journalism fair. So yes, it's important to tackle those as well. What I have also found is, working in a visual media, if those journalists don't see themselves represented already in your station, they may not want to go there. They don't want to be that token person that's there. They want to have a newsroom that looks like them, and they want to make sure that you're not just a company saying that you want diversity, but you're kind of putting, your money where your mouth is. And that's what I have found a lot in the past year, especially. More and more companies are speaking on diversity, but they're not necessarily practicing what they preach. So I think for myself, when I look at jobs, whether it's my next step or students that are asking me where they should be, I think of those companies that are actually putting the work and showing that they're trying to be diverse.
Yeah, and I would just follow up on that. And I think Scott touched on this also, this idea of commitment at the top is key. But I found in lots of shops that it's not enough often, because there are people throughout the organization who may not buy into that commitment. They may sort of say they do, pretend they do, but they actually don't believe it. So we have to hold those folks accountable. I mean, you have to kind of just say, hey, listen, this is part of your job, hiring and promoting and nurturing journalists of color. So I think it has to be sort of, in many cases, forced down to the rest of the organization. And I would also say one of the other things we've done to help expand our pool at Newsday, there was a time, and this is my second tour of duty at Newsday. I was there for 18 years before I came back 2 years ago. There was a time when we would never even look at a reporter or editor who hadn't been in the business for 5 years. I mean, and sometimes it was even more than that. Now I'm finding, though, that we're thinking, well, maybe there are not as many of those folks out there, but maybe there's some talented people who've been in the business for 3 years. So we have started hiring journalists with less experience. It's been fine. I mean, nothing's blown up in the building yet. It's worked out. So that's one way we've expanded the pool. We've also started looking more at weekly reporters. Again, there was a time when we just didn't hire weekly reporters. The sense was that they didn't have the chops, which of course was not always the case, but that was the arrogant ways of the daily media, I think. But I think now, because of this thing called social media and websites, there's really no such thing as a weekly reporter. They report daily to feed that beast online. So that's another way that we've kind of, again, tried to expand the pool. And in theory, it should be a more diverse pool.
Yeah, to piggyback off
We
that,
hired one of ours.
Yeah, that's right. Just
It's totally fine. We're totally happy for him.
I wasn't going to say that, Scott.
That's totally fine. I'm just kidding around, but it's totally fine. I'm happy for him.
To piggyback off what Calvin said, you actually, a thought came to mind. And yes, like you said, it's so important also giving those less experienced journalists maybe the chance. But I've also been involved in conversations where oftentimes hiring managers would look at top colleges. You know, they would look at the Syracuse University, those,
Mm.
and a lot of minorities cannot afford those colleges. You know, I could speak for myself. I was the second one in my family to go to college, paid all by myself, still paying student loans, as I know many of you guys are too. And it wasn't because I wasn't allowed or I couldn't get into those colleges. There was no way I could afford them. And it doesn't make those journalists, you know, less experienced or less capable of doing the job. So I think that's another big thing. Oftentimes, hiring managers are very attracted by those top colleges. And for the most part, there's going to be less minority candidates in those colleges.
True.
Absolutely. No, that's such a great point, Amy. I mean, one of the things that I've had the privilege of, doing along with Scott is, being a guest speaker every summer for the High School Summer Journalism Institute at Hofstra. And, that program pretty much focuses on a lot of the things that's, being discussed, which is, increasing diversity in the media. And so for me personally, I found that, the interest in my time, at least, taking part in that summer program, the interest among young journalists of color or young prospective journalists of color, it's certainly there. I mean, in speaking with, these students, they're, very bright-eyed and they have a plethora of questions for, myself and, my colleagues and stuff like that. And so the interest is certainly there. And as it was mentioned by, the other panelists this evening, it's, just a matter of going to those, communities in which, like you said, it's not the big name universities or schools or things of that sort, but it's getting down into the communities like, Freeport and Valley Stream and Elmont and communities where there are many people of color and they're very enriched in diversity. And like I said, you'd be surprised at just how much interest you can find among, such young prospective journalists. And so it's really, I think a lot has to do with just, as it was mentioned, putting forth that effort to go out there and find those journalists who are interested.
Yeah, we started the Summer High School Journalism Institute 6 years ago, and it was a commitment to the idea that we would recruit from communities of color, and it would be this week-long institute, and we would show the young people the fun side of journalism, the interesting side of journalism. We teach them a little bit about journalism. You can't teach a whole lot in a week, but you can teach them something. But mostly it was to gain their interest in journalism. And we've been very successful in a number of those young people, these high school students who come to us in usually 9th, 10th, or 11th grade, and they've gone on to major in journalism or media in college. Very, very important. But yes, the majority of them do not have the ability to go to a Syracuse. They're mostly going to Stony Brook, Farmingdale, and so very, very important. But my feeling was that it's important to reach them when they're in high school, because it's almost too late when they're in college, because then they've sort of figured out other majors. You really want to catch their interest while they're still in high school and spark that interest potentially. Not all of them decide they want to be journalists, but really very important to start, at the high school level. And the concept was we're going to create a pipeline from high school to college to the work world. And Nakeem is a product of that in part. He came to us through college, but that's the way, that was the concept behind it, at least.
Yeah, and I think, Scott, a week is just enough time to light a fire, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, they see something, they hear something that tells them that, hey, I want to do this. So that's plenty of time for that, I think. That's great, a great program, yeah.
Going into the next question that I have this evening, I mean, speaking on that point of, finding or seeking out, those younger reporters of color, I guess, what are some of the things that managers are looking for in reporters? Are there, I guess, certain clubs or committees or even organizations that, I guess, you're looking for when you're, looking at, a prospective reporter's resume? I guess, Calvin, you can take this question first.
I like, first of all, just a really well-rounded, varied kind of experience. you know, again, I think back to when I broke into the business. It always gets caught in my throat when I say this, but it was 1982. I took my first year job, and you know, in those days, you went to school and you did the print sequence, you did the broadcast sequence. There was a PR sequence, and the day school. And I went to the University of Missouri, and you did one of those sequences, and that was it. And of course, that's ancient history now. The sense is that you have to be able to do all of those things. You have to be able to write. You have to feel comfortable in front of a camera, behind a camera, beside a camera. You have to be comfortable on social media. So I think the key is to be able to do a little bit of all of those things and to be comfortable with them. And listen, I mean, I think the older you get, the less comfortable you are with all of those things. So we don't have that issue with folks coming out of college these days. I mean, they are comfortable and adept at all of those things. I think, I mean, clearly, and we talked about this, a second or even third language always jumps out at you. And even if it's not, I guess, one of the traditional languages, that's okay. I mean, the sense is that, hey, you're comfortable in a different environment. You're comfortable picking up new and different skills. You know, I sometimes meet students who may not speak the big languages, French or Spanish. They may be from India or Pakistan, and they won't have their language on the resume. And I'll say, hey, where's your language skill here? And they'll say, well, that's not an important language. I didn't think anybody would care about that. And I tell them, listen, a skill is a skill. Don't sell yourself short.
And Amy, the same question. I mean, what are some of the things that you look for in, you know, young reporters?
I think right now we're in a unique situation where we can be the best advocates for ourselves. So I find myself a lot in LinkedIn and seeing who is marketing themselves. You know, that you are your best tool. So even if they're college students, putting their latest, you know, for us is your latest story, that's visual. So we can see in real time what those skills are, and we can see improvement. Obviously bilingual, trilingual is always great, but you know, whatever your experiences are, I have young journalists that have experience in a certain type of sport. So that shows that, you know, they're good team players, and they can also, you know, relate to sports stories of any kind. So I think just any kind of thing that can make you marketable in some sense of the way, what, you know, like Calvin was saying, your kind of toolbox, what are the tools that you can use? And one of the things that you know, the interview, you will know kind of how that personality is. And I'm very big in just hiring nice people, because people can grow, you know, and you can nurture talent, but you just want a well-rounded, nice human being that is going to be kind to your newsroom. And it doesn't matter, you know, where their background is, but is going to be open to understanding your newsroom.
Scott, same question. What are some of the things that you look for in, you know, young reporters when you're hiring?
So a couple things. One, I think for me, I mean, we're hiring very young reporters, usually their first job right out of college. And one of the things that I look for is off-campus reporting, because when they're in college, a lot of times, a lot of their coursework will be involved in what's happening on campus. They may be involved with the school newspaper, great, maybe involved with the school television station or radio station, great. But in reality, they have to work in an off-campus environment. You know, so this is their first job. If they've done off-campus reporting before they come to us, either through an internship or some college experience, that's a huge plus for me. So that's why I always recommend that students work on getting off-campus reporting. One of the things that we did at Hofstra 2 years ago was recreate a already existing website. So we have an online website that's a multimedia website, but exclusively for off-campus reporting. So previously it was not exclusively for, but now it's exclusively. So I'm the editor advisor for that. And the idea is we have to get students off campus covering stories out in communities. And in particular, we focus on local communities surrounding Hofstra, including Hempstead, Roosevelt, Uniondale, Freeport. That's one of our big focuses. So that's first. The other thing I also look for, interestingly enough, is something where they've been involved in a team, whether it's the school newspaper or whether it's an actual sports team. It makes no difference to me, because my feeling is you have to be able to work in a collegial team atmosphere. And, Nakeem, at the Herald, we focus a lot on team reporting. So when we cover big stories, we don't cover them alone, cover them 2, 3, 4, sometimes 10 people when we do investigative series. And that's important to be able to work in a team atmosphere. So I always tell young people, if you've got some kind of teamwork in your resume, that's a big plus for me.
Yeah, and I came along the same lines.
Sure.
You mentioned groups or organizations. I'm not particularly interested in any particular, I don't think anyone is better than the other, but my sense is that I'd like to see whether you had any kind of leadership position in those organizations. Like the other skills mentioned here, I think the ability to show that you can lead, that people follow you, that people respect your leadership is a really important skill also.
I think something else that's really important, I think, we all share, whether it's Newsday or the Herald or News 12, is having local knowledge. A lot of times candidates are attractive when they're local because we don't have to teach them, who all of our legislators are, or who, the county heads are. And I think that effect, I look at myself back when I was in college and think, did I really know who all the people in charge were? So I would say to younger journalists that are in this hunt is, wherever you are looking and wherever you are interviewing, make sure you know the current events, because that will make you more attractive. Even if you just, you happen to say a couple cliff notes of what you've learned in an interview, that will spark interest.
And speaking of interview, I would just throw out one more thing. Sorry, before we go on.
No problem.
One of the things I really dislike in an interview is a candidate who doesn't have any questions. At the end, you say, hey, do you have any questions? And people who say, I don't have any questions, don't get very far with me, because that's what this business is all about, asking questions. And it should start on the interview, I think. I mean, that's pretty fundamental in my mind.
Absolutely. And, for me personally, just to throw in my 2 cents really quickly, when I started out before arriving to the Herald, as a college student, between my undergraduate program and my postgraduate program, I just took up internships, left and right. It was mentioned earlier by my fellow panelists, just the fact that it's so important to just, showcase your talents, you know what I mean? And I was, looking for things where I could showcase my writing, I could showcase my photography, I could showcase my videography or my cinematography for that matter. So I tried to delve into as much as I could, just to spruce up my resume. And as Amy mentioned, really showcase, myself to, prospective businesses and news organizations, so that they see that, I have a wide variety of interests and things like that. And so for me personally, I feel like it's just important to just get your bylines out there. That's one of the things that one of my predecessors, who I had the privilege of working with, Steve Smearty, back at the Herald, when I started out as an intern, that was one of the things that he preached to me while I was interning there was, hey man, just get as many bylines in as you can. You never know who's reading, and you'd be surprised at how many people end up seeing your name and say, hey, I know who, Nakeem Granite, I saw his byline in the Franklin Square Elmont Herald last week, or, you'd be surprised at the kind of outreach you can get just by, just getting your foot in the door and trying to delve into as much as you can. And so for me personally, I would say, just for, young prospective journalists, just try to get as much experience as you can in your field of interest. And like I said, you'd be surprised at how quickly your name goes towards the top of the list. And I guess for the next question that I have this evening, I guess how should a newsroom, balance between, making that effort to hire journalists of color while also hiring journalists who are best qualified for the job position? I mean, I'll tackle this one briefly. Something that's been, talked about during my time at the Herald covering local school districts like the Malvern School District is, the need to hire more teachers of color to, reflect the district's diverse student body. And long story short, the district's superintendent, who was Black, Dr. Lorna Lewis, she explained to parents that it's not just about hiring or seeking out teachers of color, but rather it's about hiring the best quality teachers. And so in relations to, journalism in particular, I guess I'll start with Amy. I mean, how should a newsroom make that balance between, making that effort to hire journalists of color, but also hiring journalists who are, best qualified for the job position?
It's very difficult. I'm not gonna lie. It is very difficult because you do find yourself with sometimes equally as good of candidates, and then you are left to kind of choose. And I would lie if I would say like skill alone is important. Sometimes you kind of just have to see, look around your newsroom and see, is this a voice that I need in my newsroom? Because it will benefit the newscast, it would benefit the community. We all talked about the importance of having the newsroom represent the community, right? So if you do have a newsroom full of white journalists and you have an opening, it might be the opportunity that you have to bring someone else, and it doesn't necessarily have to be Black or Hispanic, but Asian, maybe they're Muslim, whatever the case is. We need to have to try to make sure that we have a multiple diverse newsroom that represents our audience. And I think that's the most important part. It is difficult because you do want to be fair when you hire, and you want the best person. I have found myself, in that situation a couple times where I've had to choose. For the most part, I'm very lucky right now to be in a very diverse newsroom where I don't find myself in that situation, oftentimes. And for the most part, I'm hiring the best person for the job. But I think when you're in a newsroom where maybe for a very long period of time, it only hired one type of person, you might find yourself in that situation. And I would say from the Hispanic perspective, when you're looking for a job, it's difficult because I don't want to feel like I got that job primarily just because I'm a Hispanic woman. I want to get that job because I'm the best person for the job. So it's difficult.
The same question for you, Scott. I mean, especially as an executive editor, I mean, talk a bit about that challenge of, balancing between making an effort to, hire journalists of color, but also, finding the best journalists for the job.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing is, I feel pretty lucky because I'm the hiring manager. At the same time, I'm an adjunct professor, and I get to meet lots of people. And my first criteria is, do you love journalism? How much do you love it? How much do you want it? And, if the person can show that to me, then they've gone a long way to becoming a journalist at the Herald, because to my mind, it requires a pretty big commitment to want to be a journalist. It's not an easy profession. So that's my first criteria. And if you seem to have met that criterion, then you're on your way. The other thing is, I don't think it's that hard. I mean, it's not hard to find really well qualified journalists of color. You just have to look in the right places. You just have to look for them, because they may not be, as I mentioned before, they may not be coming to you, so you have to go to them. So that's really my strategy. The other thing I think is important is training. Once people are on board, it's critical that you keep training. No matter what, no matter what the publication is, I happen to feel that ongoing training is so critical, because ongoing training is really what levels the playing field for everybody, because then you're providing a consistency of training. You may have somebody coming in from one school, you may have somebody coming in from another school. There may be two different standards at those two different schools. So you've got to balance that out. How do you balance that out? You balance that out through consistent training, weekly training. We do a training every week at the Herald on any number of subjects. And I find that that balances it out no matter what college you went to. If you have one from from the other, it doesn't matter so long as you're training. And then the final thing, I guess the final thing I would say to that point is it's important to note that in my experience, not every journalist of color is necessarily interested in covering diversity issues. And you have to really leave it up to the journalist, and you have to, let them lead on terms of what they want to cover. We've had journalists who come in and they're really into diversity issues. We had one young woman 3 or 4 years ago. She went out to Los Angeles Times, but she was really into it and really into covering DACA and really did a bang up job, amazing job. And then we have other journalists who just want to be journalists, sports writer, no particular interest necessarily in covering diversity issues. And that's fine too. Either way it works.
Scott, you just reminded me of again, that first job I had back in the early 80s. And I was the only a reporter of color on the business news staff there. And I was so conscious and paranoid that I avoided covering stories about Black and brown people for the first year because I didn't want to be pigeonholed. My fear was that everyone would think, well, he's the black reporter, so he's going to cover the Black issues.
Right.
Now, I discovered, of course, that wasn't the case. It was just kind of, again, my paranoia. But it took me, I would say, a year or so just to loosen up and to be willing. And I should have done it from the beginning in hindsight, but to be comfortable enough to cover stories, again, that matter most to Black and brown people. So that's a great point you make there at the end. I think also, Nakeem, just back to your general question, I don't necessarily see any tension or conflict between those two.
Okay.
I mean, again, just as Scott said, I think there are plenty of qualified candidates of color. May take patience. There's competition for those folks, especially these days. But I think they're out there. You have to work at it. It's hard. I mean, and I tell the newsroom all the time that that recruiting is a team sport. So I lean on the folks to tell me who they know. Who do you know? Tell me your friends. Give me the names of people you know, people whose work you admire. Let's get to know them. So it's a process. It takes a while.
Yeah, I had a similar experience to Calvin in that there was a time where I was reporting and I was in the field and I kept getting assigned the kind of the Hispanic beat stories, and I didn't want it. I wanted to be in breaking news. I wanted to be covering the fires, the shootings. That exciting stuff was what got my blood boiling, and my adrenaline going. And I, for a long time, kind of felt a little in a box because of it. Now, looking back, I can see from a management side that perhaps it was, I was the best person to tell the story because those folks felt more connected to me because I could speak their language. So there is that side to it. But I think, Scott is dead on with what he says. You have to kind of let the journalists decide if that's where they want to go, because you don't want to make them feel like they're being, pigeonholed to this is what you're supposed to do. And back to the original point, I will say the resume isn't everything, because we were talking about universities and we were talking about, backgrounds and stuff like that, and even internships, right? So from my experience, when I was in school, I wasn't able to do a lot of internships because I was working full time while I was in school because I was trying to pay off for the student loans. So the internship isn't everything, but you have to take a chance on certain people. So if they really impressed you and you think that they have a passion for it, take a chance and invest in them.
Absolutely. And just a brief point that I wanted to mention. It's funny now that Calvin brought up the point of not wanting to be pigeonholed. I think back to when I first started out, just briefly, just as I reflect, I also had that same angst of not wanting to be pigeonholed into, oh, here's the Black journalist who's going to cover issues related to the community of people of color, or, nothing but sports and stuff like that. And early on, I wanted to prove that, I'm not just someone who's, going to cover, or who's going to follow those stereotypes. I'm someone who is, in fact, I have such a diverse interest in so many different things. And so I started out covering everything from local government to schools to so many different issues going on in, the communities that I had the privilege of covering. And so early on, I had that same angst too. But as time went on, I also started to open up and realize that I can feel free and confident to cover whatever it is that I want to cover, and not be afraid of being pigeonholed or anything like that, because, my work speaks for itself. So, all interesting points that were brought up on that question. And I guess, sorry, go ahead, Scott.
Your award-winning work.
Yes, that's right. Not to boast or anything like that, but yes, that is true. I guess lastly, before we throw it to the audience for Q&A, just one last question for this evening for the panelists. I guess lastly, when you read and watch the news now, I guess, do you feel like we're heading in the right direction with regards to, news outlets nurturing a more diverse newsroom? I guess, Calvin, you can take this question to start.
Sure. It's funny you ask that question, because I always say that I've seen this movie before. There's always some disruptive event, like George Floyd, for instance, and then there's all this hand wringing in the media about, oh, we have to do this, we have to do that, we have to hire better, and then time goes by, and then we're back to where we started. Essentially, there's this big eruption, and we do the same thing. It's the same scene over and over again. I mean, this may be different. It feels like it's slightly different, but time will tell. Time will tell. So the jury is still out in my mind, Hakeem.
Okay. And for Scott, the same question. I guess, do you feel like we're heading in the right direction right now?
I guess it would depend on the newsroom. Some newsrooms, yes. Many, no. If you look at it statistically across the country, probably about 95% of small to medium-sized daily newsrooms have no journalists of color, or very few, but most have none. So that's not good. That statistic really hasn't changed very much. And until we really see it across the spectrum of news, most metropolitan areas have fairly diverse newsrooms, depending on the city, of course. But if you come to a New York metropolitan area, yes, most metropolitan area newsrooms are fairly diverse. But if you look nationwide, that's not necessarily the case. So we've got a long way to go. We have a long way to go. I mean, I was lucky enough because I grew up in a very diverse neighborhood, and I was surrounded by diversity. So, it was like something that was, to me, when I became a journalist, these are the issues that I wanted to cover. When I became executive editor, this is the issue that I wanted to tackle in our own newsroom. I want to tackle it as a professor because I happen to believe, just of my own experiences growing up, how important it is.
For you, Amy, I mean, same question. I mean, where do you feel like we're heading right now? Do you think we're heading in the right direction with regards to, creating a more diverse newsroom?
I think I would agree with both points, but I would also add that from my belief, from my experience, one of the reasons why I think there is this wave of, it seems like change, but maybe it doesn't, and maybe it's just a little bit of lip service for a while, is because more and more I do not see people of color and diverse backgrounds in hiring spots. I don't see them in management and upper management newsrooms. I'm one, from me personally, I'm one of a few, and I'm lucky to have a few, right? There's other newsrooms that you go to these conferences and you speak to people and they all look the same. So I think until those people that are in decisions of power look like the world, we won't start seeing that full diversity across the country.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all. Thank you to all the panelists for taking the time out of their busy schedules this evening, I guess, and we can open it up now to Q&A.
But I'm curious to Calvin, Amy, and Scott, if your newsrooms have addressed having either mandatory or optional or offering Spanish classes? Because I've thought about how really I want to do it. I mean, Amy's a friend of mine, and Amy, you know that I text you sometimes, just, did I get this right? Or can you translate this one line just so I understand what someone was saying? And I'm embarrassed sometimes that I didn't take Spanish in high school. And I've thought how cool it could be maybe if newsrooms offered that. So just curious, I don't think this was addressed, but curious if this has ever come up in your newsrooms and what you think about it.
Sorry to say, I think it's great where there are the resources. You know, I think back again to my first stint at Newsday, and we in fact did have a Spanish speaker or Spanish teacher come in to teach Spanish classes. It's really expensive, really expensive. So it's tough. I mean, it's a great idea, but I think, again, depending on resources, it could be a tough sell. You know, one of the things, and I think you've seen it, I've sent the note around. We created a document at Newsday in the newsroom with each reporter's name and all the languages that they speak. That way it's readily available and accessible if someone needs the quick kind of translation that Cecilia mentioned. So that's just another way to possibly get at it also.
I think it's a great idea. But as somebody who, I mean, I served in the Peace Corps and in Bulgaria, and I've been learning Bulgarian for 30 years. And I can tell you, I mean, in part because my wife is Bulgarian and we speak Bulgarian at home. But I can tell you, I wouldn't personally, having studied that much, I would not feel confident translating for a story. I'm advanced in terms of my skill level. My feeling is, in order to translate, you have to have near native skills because, you know, that's the level of, now you can have grown up in a bilingual home, and that would certainly do it, you know, or have native skills. You know, somebody like Amy, who's you know, from Cuba. I don't want to speak for her, but you know, that's the level that you really need to have it at, to my mind. So to kind of learn it a little bit, you know, through the lessons that we might offer, which, you know, I mean, obviously Calvin's right, it's expensive to offer it. I think it's a great idea because it probably build higher cultural awareness, you know, but if the idea is to have translation skills, I don't think that would necessarily do it, but it would definitely increase cultural awareness, which would be really, really important.
And Amy, does it, I feel like, you know, I think you have probably other friends who reach out to you asking for help. Does it drive you nuts?
I'm the go-to person, and lately I feel like more and more, you know, with sensitivity issues, people do call me and say, hey, do you feel comfortable doing this, or do you mind doing this? I welcome it because it's adding a voice, you know, to my community in an important topic. So and more I think it's important for you know, whether it's Hispanic journalists or whatever the case, ask us our perspective. Don't expect us to give it, you know, don't expect us to be like that one person you always go to, like, so how do you feel about this topic? Because then that could also be draining. I don't want to be the person that always explains, you know, Cuba and communism to all my friends. If you care that much, do some research yourself, you know. But if you know, in a bind, of course, ask. But as far as classes, I know as far as News 12 goes, we do, you know, they offer some type of X amount of credits, you know, for college. And I think that's a great idea. If anyone's interested in taking the time and taking a few classes, maybe not to translate, but maybe to communicate with someone in the field to be able to say, you know, what happened here. And I will say, I do appreciate the reporters that come to me after their story and say, hey, I was able to, you know, say a couple words like, ¿Qué pasa aquí? ¿Qué pasó? And then they gave me the whole thing. Can you help me translate it? I appreciate that effort. So for anyone like you that I know you try to do that, I think that just the trying is a big deal.
And Amy, as a Cuban, you can really help them speak really fast too. Really fast Spanish.
Yeah, hard to understand sometimes.
Hey, everyone. Thanks for doing this. It's a great conversation. And I'm from Pittsburgh, by the way, which was a hotbed of the Black journalism community for many, many years, and I believe still is. So I'm very proud of that.
Standard there, was that?
Yeah, the Courier, and I'm not sure the name of the paper that's there now, but I know that they still have one that's still alive and well. So I thought the point about diversity in the newsroom and reporters who come in don't necessarily want to be pigeonholed into covering certain communities is a really interesting one. And I feel like it sort of works both ways. I think we have to remember too that this is obviously about diversity in the newsroom itself and hiring. Geez, the setbacks that we've had lately, and I think the pandemic is one of them, has really set us back. We've always tried very hard to keep our newsroom diverse, and that's been a real it's just made it more difficult than usual. But overarching that out on the East End is the housing issue. Our ability to hire the reporters that we want to hire, which I've been able to do in my 20 some years as executive editor. I've been able to think about diversity in hirings because we get applications from all over, certainly the East Coast, but we've actually hired from all over the country. I don't have that option anymore because there is literally no place for a young reporter to live and work for me. And the point I wanted all that to make is to say that that doesn't remove the responsibility from us to find diversity in our coverage, though. And I think so much of it is about you've got to find the people to do that coverage. And if you have to look in your community for help with that, then you do. We've had help. Brendan has done some stories in his section involving the Spanish-speaking community, and we've gotten help from some of the local organizations to serve as translators. It's important to us. You know, one of the underserved communities that we have is the Native American community out our way, and we have really made a concerted effort to make inroads into covering it. And for a time, we had a reporter who was not Hispanic, but she was bilingual, and having her on staff to be able to cover the Spanish-speaking community was just wonderful. So it's not always, I mean, having more diversity in the newsroom is obviously crucial because you need those perspectives, but you also just need to have reporters who can get out into those communities and tell those stories. That's equally important to us. So even though it's tough to make those hirings right now, it doesn't remove that responsibility from us. It's just a point I wanted to make. Otherwise, great conversation, guys. Thank you.
I would just quickly add to Joseph. I think he made a great point about, you don't have to be a minority to cover minority issues. What I have found has been successful is those journalists that build a relationship, right? So I recall one of the reporters that was very successful working in the Bronx, and her background, white girl, from Westchester County, and she really made an impact in the Bronx because she went there time and time again. She told their stories. She was there on her days off, getting to know the community. People saw her there not just for work, but building relationship and building trust. And I think that's the most important thing, is building trust with those communities that you're trying to cover, and listening. I can't stress enough how important that is, especially when it's not, your perspective and your experience. Listening to people that have had those experiences, because at the end of the day, we're passionate about telling stories. That's the most important thing. So I don't think you need to be, a certain background or a certain color to do that correctly. You just really need to care, to listen, and to build that trust.
But I'm wondering if the panelists, from your personal experiences, Amy, you indicated that you may have felt a bit of an outsider. If others approached the job with their own texture and idiom of their own cultures and felt that they had to do some measure of code shifting in order to become employed, and were conscious about that, and perhaps felt inauthentic by speaking with standard English as not their most comfortable form of expression.
I can say for me, so I find this interesting now with young journalists that are very, they grow up with a different perspective, and they're very sure in who they are, and they're unapologetically themselves. And I was not like that when I was their age. And I applaud them for it. But I recently had an experience where a journalist corrected me when I said her name. And I was just like, good on you. I should, and from then on, I said her name correctly. My name, as I was given my name by my parents, is Aime. It's Aime Rodriguez. And when I came to the States, it was quickly changed in school to Amy. And I became Amy Rodriguez. And I have this kind of double identity with my professional job, that it's Amy Rodriguez or Amy Rodriguez. And when I'm at home, I'm Aime, and that's the name that I hear when I'm almost in trouble all the time. So to that point, you mentioned a little bit of shape-shifting, and I would say yes. I grew up in everybody just spoke Spanish. When I moved to New York and I came to school to come to New York, I'm originally from Miami, I always heard, where's your accent from? You have a little bit of an accent. And I did not have a Spanish accent. I had a Miami accent. The Jewish, Indian, wherever they're from in Miami, all speak the same way. They have that little bit of a Miami accent. And when I moved to New York, I was very self-conscious about it, to the point where I went to voice coaches and I tried to switch, to change it. Now, when I go back home, I can quickly, turn it back, and the Miami comes back very quick. But it is a little bit of a change. And when you have a newsroom, when you're maybe the only one, it becomes that conversation of, well, am I just doing the stories because I'm the only one here? Maybe if there was more than one, it wouldn't be perceived as that. And I wouldn't say you totally hide who you are, but there is a part of you that says, well, will they accept who I totally am?
You also
yes, and that
indicate
gets. Oh, sorry.
No, please go ahead. The only thing I was going to add to that was when you were talking about reporting in Spanish, there's texture and idiom and things that are germane to that culture that may not translate into standard English. But the managers and editors lose that flavor by not encouraging it, and yet the applicant, the young person, may not feel confident about expressing it. So I see the challenge, and I wonder if each of you have had to face that as you came aboard and tried to get into the wider culture to bring your own flavor with you.
Yes, and that gets back to where we started this conversation with this notion of belonging. If you have that sense of belonging, then you don't even care about those things, David. I mean, you're just yourself. You bring what you have, and Amy is right. Younger folks are like that. It's like take me as I am, and I think that's a good thing. I really do. I mean, there's no need to force everyone into the same box. Otherwise, it's boring, it's stale, it's dry, it's just not as interesting. So yes, you do you, that's kind of my mantra, you do you.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, our newsroom, I think Nikim could talk about this too. Pretty much you are who you are, and we're not gonna, make judgments on that, and we're gonna accept you for who you are. So be who you are. We've had people who've been unapologetic in every way. This is who I am. The young woman that I was telling you about who went out to Los Angeles Times, she was definitely, Nikim's laughing. She was definitely her, without any apologies. And that was and Jeff's laughing too. That was totally fine. It worked great. And she's terrific. And that's, but it's a question of acceptance. It really is. I think Calvin's right. It's a question of acceptance.
Do copy editors accept that?
Well, we write in standard English, if that's what you're asking. And she wrote in standard English, but in terms of her personality and who she was, she was who she was. She wasn't going to apologize for it.
Yeah, and I think if you're in a shop where you can't be yourself, then you need to move on. I think. I mean, that's as quickly as possible.
Absolutely. No, I'll say briefly that, I was, always a pretty reserved guy, but at the same time, I was never afraid to, express myself and things of that sort in terms of who I am and my interest and stuff like that. You get to know me, and right away, you'll know my interest and my likes and dislikes and all of that stuff. And, you know, obviously, as Scott mentioned, when it came down to, you know, actually reporting and stuff, it was, you know, all, you know, AP style, standard English, all that good stuff. But in terms of creating those relationships with, you know, your fellow reporters and your fellow staff members, or even your sources and stuff like that, you know, I was never afraid to, you know, be myself, of course, in a professional manner, but at the same time, you know, just being yourself and not afraid to express who you are and things of that sort.
I just want to add one very important thing, in my opinion,
Sure.
just because it is, you know, the Hispanic Heritage Month. And I would say it's important to cover diverse issues all year round, not just when it's, you know, now it's Hispanic Heritage Month, so I see more and more Hispanic stories. Let's not lose sight of they're important all year round, not just when, you know, it's popular. Same thing goes for, you know, the LGBTQ community, the Black community, all communities out there. Let's just make sure that we cover them, you know, January through December, not just in their designated months.
Amen.
Definitely.
Absolutely. Great. Well, Amy, Calvin, Scott, I want to thank all three of you for joining me on the panel this evening and for promoting a really great thought-provoking discussion. I really got a lot out of it personally. I hope the audience got a lot out of it as well. And yeah, just thank you for just taking the time to, you know, have this much needed discussion.
You're
Thank
welcome.
you, Nakeem. Great
I
job.
enjoyed it.
Thanks
be
everybody
safe.
for coming.
Yes.
Take care.